Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our second CSHHH summer school. And today our webinar is looking at cultures of well-being. So I'm really excited that we've got two historians here to talk about this theme with us. The first is Dr. ChiChi Huang. ChiChi Huang is a historian of British Empire in Southeast Asia and South China, with particular interests in imperial culture, public health and climate. So ChiChi will be discussing a very new research project she's looking at on Mothercraft in Hong Kong and the technologies used to disseminate these messages. We'll also be hearing from Dr. Kay Nias. So Kay, like ChiChi, is also currently working at the University of Strathclyde as a research associate on the medical humanities in China and the UK project. She spent 2018 at the Science Museum London as a Medicine Galleries Research Fellow and completed her PhD on the history of physiotherapy at the University of Exeter. Today she'll be taking a sidestep and talking about the history of the modern fitness industry. So like last week, we'll have both of our speakers present on their work, and then this will be followed by some discussion, and we'll answer some of the questions that you guys put forward. So for all of our participants who are tuning in today, please feel free to submit questions or comments for ChiChi and Kay. You can do that using the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen, or else using the chat button either. So either of those will work. So thanks everyone who's tuned in. And just to let you know that next week we don't have a webinar taking place. Instead, we've got a Twitter conference featuring some of our PhD students. So please follow our Twitter account next week and tune into that. And then we'll be back again on the 6th of August with a webinar with Jem Mills and Peter Clark, who'll be talking about drugs and drug cultures. Okay, so we'll get started. So Dr. ChiChi Huang is going to start with her presentation, and then we'll follow that with Kay's talk. So whenever you're ready, ChiChi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Laura, for that, and thanks for everyone for joining in. I'm just going to share my screen. Cool. Laura, is that all good? Okay, great. So as Laura mentioned, my background is as a historian of the British Empire in the South China Seas and the British Empire connections to Southeast Asia. So I've always really focused on imperial cultures and the creation of knowledge and how that circulates back to Britain and to the colonies as well, and with a particular emphasis on the entanglements of climate, the environment, and notions of health. So this is a bit of a new project, and it all started because I came across this source from the Wellcome Library when one of their archivists, Angela Saywood, was in Glasgow presenting at the CCA here. And it is an instructional video entitled The Students of Mothercraft, and it's attributed to G.H. Byrne, who was a nurse, a supervisor and training officer of health nurses at the Harcourt Health Centre in Hong Kong from 1947 to 1962. And from what I can gather, I did come across this video source just before lockdown in the UK. So unfortunately, I've had very limited access to archives and information, but from the bits that I can gather, G.K. Byrne was, is that story of an imperial nurse who was trained in Britain and then worked in different colonies, training other nurses, local nurses in different colonies, predominantly in the West Indies and Hong Kong, and a little bit in Nigeria. And the students, so it's attributed to her, but the Students of Mothercraft image on the right-hand side there states that it's created, or it's produced, the film is produced by the Hong Kong Medical Office. So it would be interesting to know sort of her connection to that, or whether, you know, that was a big office in itself that creates a lot of educational videos and training videos there in Hong Kong as well. So the video starts with these two images, these two scenes. The woman sat there on the left picks up that book, opens it and studies it and looks at the pages with a lot of interest, and we get an insert of the image on the right there, which tells us that we're going to learn about the students of Mothercraft in Hong Kong. And in this instructional video, it documents it documents various lessons and methods of teaching students of Mothercraft, who we identify as the students dressed in white on the right-hand side there, who I imagine were nurses or training to be nurses or midwives. However, it's really unclear because the video also pictures this this instructional video as lessons to young women in general. The narrator starts by saying, the search for knowledge is expected of all healthy young people. Girls are naturally interested in the subject of Mothercraft. Some are lucky enough to have special classes at the health center where they can learn together with mothers and real babies, as pictured on the left. And we see, as she's talking over this, these women with their babies strapped on their back, or they're holding the babies, file in and sit there opposite these students of Mothercraft. This video itself has this dubbed narrator track over the film, so potentially there could have been a Cantonese track or a Mandarin. I'm thinking it would have been Cantonese, given its audience, track on top, but I'm unsure. But it would be interesting to see. It's interesting to see the commentary that the narrator provides, and at times it's a little bit patronizing, or I felt it was a little bit patronizing, you know, obviously looking back on it today, but it was quite modern in the sense that it advocated for prevention is better than cure, and some other elements which I'll talk about in a little bit. So it went through various lessons, including, it started with baby's toilet, and then it progressed to baby's day, which emphasized routine, which was really key to the Mothercraft movement and teachings. And then safety for baby, which looked at the environment at the home, as well as, and then it went back to feeding baby, which is kind of about baby's day. And it really emphasized the significance of breast milk. The narrator states, mother's milk is meant for baby, and enthusiastically she adds, so we must do all in our power to make sure he gets it. And there's just so much in this 28-minute video that I could dissect, but today I really wanted to bring two, I guess, tropes or points that I see that really kind of captured me when I saw this video. And this is where I hope to take my further research to see if I can make something a bit bigger than just this video, a bit bigger than, you know, just talking about this video itself, which is an interesting historical artifact in itself. So the first point I want to make is about Mothercraft, because that's the topic of the video. And the Mothercraft movement really came into effect or gained popularity in the early 20th century. And it was really conceived of as this sort of scientific intervention into motherhood, and into, you know, having proper medicalized and scientific knowledge, guiding proper provision of infant care and toddler care. And it all kind of came together around this figure, Sir Truby King, who was a New Zealand-born physician trained in Britain at the University of Edinburgh, and again mimics that sort of British imperial doctor narrative where he was trained, you know, in the metropole in Britain, and then went back to the colonies to try and implement the knowledge, the medical knowledge that was sanctioned from the center as such. So he was not a trained pediatrician, which was a new field. But he truly believed and wrote many books around providing proper maternal care, and he really emphasized the routine, and that had to do with proper sleep, a sleep routine, developing a sleep routine and a feeding routine. And he was a big proponent of breast milk, believing that mothers had to be taught the proper way to breastfeed. So that's kind of the scientific background or the scientific motivations for Mothercraft, the Mothercraft movement. The historiography that we have of the Mothercraft movement has looks at local or specific Mothercraft centres, because many of these centres and movements were initiated across the British Empire by very local needs. And I've only really gone through the Mothercraft movements in the British Empire. There is a whole, I mean, this was a big movement in the US, in the States as well. So, but from what I can gather from the current historiography, a lot of it was motivated by local needs. So for example, in South Africa, historian S.E. Duff talks about the development of these centres as motivated by the needs of the white Britons in South Africa to rear the next generation of imperialists to sustain the colony in South Africa. So these centres were not for white Afrikaans, let alone the indigenous populations in South Africa. Whereas in Britain, the Mothercraft movement was very much incorporated into state services and implemented by the state. And through the state, you know, and their representatives in social workers and midwives, there was an early, it provided the state with a way of identifying what they thought of as negligent or incompetent mothers or families that were considered at risk, without an early, in the early decades, a comprehension of perhaps the socio-economic conditions that surrounded proper care for infants and toddlers. And so a lot of the current literature identifies the problematic nature in which this sort of medical knowledge was used for local contexts. And all of this literature really emphasizes the top-down nature of all of this knowledge. And this isn't a surprise, given that Mothercraft is, you know, conceived of as that intersection between motherhood and science, right? But I think this particular video kind of challenges this characterization of Mothercraft. So the two images on the right there, I want to use those two as an example. Those two images show a woman using a fabric sling to attach and secure the baby to the body with the help of a Mothercraft student or a Mothercraft trainee. So we see the woman in the bottom right with the white lab coat. She is the doctor or the professional throughout the entire video. And we see the student dressed in the black coat with the white peeping out, assisting the mother attaching the sling, the baby with the sling. Now, this sling itself and the use of this fabric fabric harness was also characterized as quite Orientalist, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where we have British commentators in Hong Kong and South China talking about a lot of boat women and local village women, you know, as peculiar beings for having all these children you know, wrapped around their bodies while they're doing a million other tasks. So here we see this sort of tension, I think, between a sense of instinctual knowledge, where these local women have used these slings and wraps you know, by themselves, but then they're being assisted by these modern images of medical knowledge to try and attach the sling to the body itself. And it's, when you watch the video, it's quite a clumsy sort of interaction between the two women assisting the woman with the baby on her back, as you know, as she wouldn't have probably had any help if she was back at home trying to wrap this sling around her. So it becomes this kind of performance of science and modernity with local instinctual behavior. And I think that sort of tension in Mothercraft hasn't really been spoken about before. Another tension that I see here is this sort of local knowledge versus medical knowledge. So a lot of, throughout the video, we see sort of adaptation of local climate and context to, you know, what's best for baby. So even though they're advocating that you should keep the baby close to you and use that sling, they also stated the reasons why was because you create a bond. So the creation of a motherly bond and a motherly instinct is through this behavior itself. And then they also emphasize that the use of different fabrics in different seasons for the sling will also assist. So again, we see this sort of scientific and medicalizing rhetoric and rationale for quite instinctual and local practices. So I think that given that the Mothercraft movement was this global movement and it had all these different iterations throughout in different places, I think we perhaps there is value in kind of looking at the local practices and how it was adopted and perhaps co-opted by scientific and medicalized language in the implementation of these training centers that we see. And I think maybe Hong Kong might be a place to start with that. And I think I'm running a bit over time, so I'm not going to talk about the other two images, but they're just further examples of how there's this tension between the local knowledge and the medical knowledge and the instinctual knowledge versus the scientific knowledge. The last point that I'm just going to quickly make is this is a training video, and I've not seen before a training video of Mothercraft, and it's quite consciously a training video as well. So we see the image on the left there with that very with that child just staring straight down the barrel of the camera, and the student of Mothercraft also staring at the camera as well, saying, look, I'm measuring them, I'm checking their growth. So there's a lot of elements of staging, and we see that, you know, at the start as well, with the filing in of the mothers on one side and the filing in of the students of Mothercraft on the other side. So I think in itself, this is a very interesting video in terms of thinking about medical health education and the dissemination of that health education either to professionals, or perhaps this was, you know, for larger audiences. I don't know yet. I will figure it out. But it's, yeah, I think this is another element that is worth exploring. So I will leave it at there. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, ChiChi. That was super interesting. And that video is available online through the Wellbeing library?
It is, yes.
Okay.
If anyone's interested, I can send a link. Yeah.
Perfect, excellent. Yeah, no, I'm really interested to see how that project develops. It's really, really interesting. So again, just to remind people, if you have any questions or comments for ChiChi or for Kay, who's going to speak shortly, please just submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or the chat function, and then we'll have some discussion after the two talks based on those questions. So thanks again, ChiChi. And next up is Kay. So whenever you're ready, Kay, if you want to load up your PowerPoint as well.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Thanks, ChiChi.
Pleasure.
Perfect.
Can you see this?
Yeah, that's great.
Sorry, guys. Play from start. There we go. Sorry guys. Yeah, so thank you. So for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Kay. Thank you, Laura, for giving me the opportunity to speak today and for organising such a great series of events. To dive right in, for a number of reasons, fitness, exercise, and the spaces we do our physical activities have been at the forefront of many of our minds over the past 4 months. From the closure of our sports centres, gyms and pools to daily exercise prescriptions and the boom of online fitness platforms and rise in demand for stay-at-home gym equipment, the recent pandemic has given many of us a chance to slow down and really consider how and where we take exercise, why we do it and what it really means to us. Like many others, I was eager to hear the government guidelines regarding the reopening of gyms and indoor pools earlier in the month. And those who tuned in will remember Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden declared to the nation that it is now the time to work out, to help out. This public invocation followed the Chancellor's launch of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme the previous day. Indeed, both of these catchy slogans are part of the broader government campaign to get people to return to public spaces and get the hospitality and leisure industry back on track. So whilst reflecting on the theme of today's seminar, cultures of wellness, and in light of my own research into physical culture and particularly the history of therapeutic exercise, Dowden's statement got me thinking about the nature of our contemporary fitness industry and where it comes from. I think that the recent pandemic and the current political climate really invites us to reflect upon the sort of social, cultural and therapeutic functions that we want our fitness and leisure spaces to perform. Research into the history of fitness, sport and exercise is essential then to help us understand how modern fitness culture has become what it is today and recognise the ways in which certain inherited ideologies, body ideals, beliefs and practices which have evolved over the past 2 centuries continue to inhibit or obstruct the realisation of a more inclusive, diverse and shared culture of fitness and well-being. So for the next 10 to 15 minutes or so, I'm going to just discuss really very briefly 3 of the most historically significant transformations in the modern gym and fitness industry in order to illuminate some of these important themes. So there we go. So of course, Dowden's plea to the public to work out to help out is by no means the first time that the government has shown an interest in the population's exercising habits. In fact, interest in people's fitness, physical strength and health was a nationalist concern that permeated Europe and North America after the Napoleonic Wars and intensified throughout the 19th century. It was in a climate of fear about the poor physical standards of military recruits that a number of gymnastic systems were developed. The 2 most influential being the German system Turnen and Swedish Gymnastics. These systems grew out of nationalist sentiment and aimed to restore national strength by uplifting the physical fitness of national populations. Gymnastics was an international phenomenon, and the term the Battle of the Systems refers to the controversy spanning the 19th and early 20th centuries as the most effective system of exercise to use in physical education and military training. So to use Swedish gymnastics very briefly as a case study to articulate some of these themes a little further, Swedish gymnastics was born from the work of Per Ling, who in 1813 founded and became director of the Royal Central Institute of Gymnastics in Stockholm, the world's first government-sponsored institution in charge of a country's physical upbringing. The purpose of the institute was to train Swedish gymnasts to work in the army, hospitals and schools nationwide. Swedish gymnastics was unique because unlike other systems that were only appropriate for strengthening the already healthy body, Swedish gymnastics could be adapted and applied to weaker and sick bodies too. Indeed, the system included not only physical education, but also military gymnastics and medical gymnastics or physical therapy. Swedish gymnastics was exported through the emigration of Swedish gymnasts trained at the institute. The scientific grounding and broad appeal of the system made it highly influential, shaping political, pedagogical and medical thinking across the continent. Swedish gymnastics and physical culture more broadly in this period intersected with first wave feminism in many ways. For example, in Britain in 1878, the London School Board appointed Swedish gymnast Concordia Löfving as First Lady Superintendent of Physical Exercises, and together with successor fellow Swedish gymnast Martina Bergman Osterberg, they established the new profession of gym mistress. They trained over 1,400 gymnasts and included and introduced Swedish gymnasts to almost 300 elementary schools. In 1887, Bergman Osterberg founded the first women's-only physical training college in Hampstead, and many of her students went on to open their own physical training colleges and became prominent suffrage campaigners, such as Rhoda Anstey, who founded the Gymnastic Teachers Suffrage Society in 1909. Together, these women ensured that female physical education was firmly on the map and dominated by the Swedish system for the next half a century. And the wonderful image on the left there shows 3 female Swedish gymnasts at the Royal Central Institute in the late 19th century. So while Swedish gymnastics and physical culture undoubtedly contributed to women's liberation and empowerment, the movement was ultimately conservative, and conventional gender roles remained intact. Female physical emancipation was underpinned by what has been called a eugenic feminism, which stressed racial progress, national regeneration, and getting women fit for motherhood. By contrast, men's fitness was linked to their usefulness as workers and soldiers. So as we can see in this movement, fitness was far more about function than form. Swedish gymnastics was also the basis for the development of exercise technology. In the 1850s, Swedish physician and gymnast Gustaf Sander designed over 76 different gym machines based upon the principles of Swedish gymnastics. First introduced in Sweden in the 1860s, so-called Sander Institutes, which you can see in the images in the middle and on the bottom right there, mushroomed globally. By 1920, there were over 126 of these institutes worldwide, not including the equipment on ocean liners, in private clinics, orthopedic departments, spas, and even in people's homes. However, while modern fitness centres and equipment has much in common with that of Sander, their aims were very different. Whereas today, they are used voluntarily for resistance training, often to perfect the body, Sander machines had a therapeutic function. These machines were designed for chronic orthopedic conditions such as scoliosis and disabilities resulting from diseases such as polio and tuberculosis, which were common amongst the population at the time. These machines represented some of the first physical rehabilitation available. For instance, when in Germany mandatory accident insurance was imposed in 1884, making employers responsible for accidents in the workplace, over 62 institutes were established there, as it was thought to be the most efficient way of getting workers back to work as quickly as possible. Unsurprisingly then, the First World War was both the zenith and the beginning of the end for this apparatus. While the unprecedented demand for rehabilitation meant that mechanotherapy became extraordinarily important, the authentic Sander equipment became more diluted. The wartime economy drive and post-war depression meant that these machines were often replicated or adapted, for example, at the Red Cross Clinic for the Treatment of Disabled Officers in London, where copies were made using cheaper materials and less aesthetic appeal, as shown in the image there on the right, the top right. So moving on. So gymnastic systems, physical education, and therapeutic exercise provided the backdrop for the rapid development of a more commercialized physical culture at the end of the 19th century. 3 important innovations in particular had a great impact upon the evolution of the modern fitness industry, namely advertising, the mass circulation of periodicals, and photography and film. Jointly, these innovations contributed to the increasing display and commercial exploitation of body ideals. Eugene Sandow, pictured on the left, was widely hailed as the father of British physical culture movement, but the phenomena extended well beyond Sandow and incorporated a range of bodies and exercise systems. Born in 1867, Sandow came to fame displaying his strength and physique on the music hall circuit in the late 1880s. Tapping into a thriving visual culture, he marketed himself as a perfect muscular beauty and a sculpture come to life, often presenting himself as a modern Hercules. Sandow's body was idolized by both the sciences and the arts, deemed both scientifically and aesthetically perfect. In 1893, for example, he visited Harvard University, where he was measured by physical educator and machine developer Dudley Allen Sargent, who described him as the most wonderful specimen of man I have ever seen. And later in 1905, The Lancet observed him as a magnificent example of bodily perfection. Sandow traded on his body to promote his system of physical development in manuals, correspondence courses, and institutes. He sold equipment such as his combined developer, which included a chest expander, dumbbells, and weighted apparatus that could be attached to the door, and which was marketed as appropriate for the entire family, including women and children. Although advertised in journals and books across the world, individuals like Sandow were no longer only strongmen and spectacles to be viewed at the circus, but increasingly their bodies became products for sale within the reach of readers who now had a chance for self-improvement and to sculpt their own bodies to similar perfection. Framing the construction of body ideals, ideas about fitness, and the development of exercise technology at this time was anxiety about racial degeneration, a concept built upon colonialism, eugenic thought, Darwinian evolution theory, and turn-of-the-century cultural pessimism towards modernity. While this period can be viewed in some ways as democratizing fitness, it also saw a shift towards more aesthetic goals and the definition of normative hegemonic body ideals defined in contrast to countertypes such as the emaciated or deformed urban poor, the fat, sedentary businessman, and the colonial other. So moving swiftly forwards now, interest and participation in fitness has exploded since the 1970s. While the history is of course complex, the 70s and 80s saw the beginning of gyms and fitness becoming a global industry and socio-cultural phenomena. Landmarks such as Gold's Gym and the movie Pumping Iron put bodybuilding and icons such as Arnold Schwarzenegger on the global map. At the same time, women like Jane Fonda became iconic for choreographed workouts, who through videos and books made it possible for housewives to exercise in front of the television at home. An Americanized vision with global reach. In the past 4 decades, we have witnessed fitness transform into a multi-billion-dollar industry and mass participation event. Today, the spaces we perform our physical activities are changing. We can see the increasing popularity of online fitness platforms, the standardization of physical activities, as well as a number of enterprises such as Les Mills International that through franchising can market and sell their products and ideas on fitness, exercise, bodies, and global health throughout the world. Many of us then take for granted that aspiring to fitness and a fit and healthy body is a good thing and a sign of responsible citizenship. But as Jane Fonda's troubling 20-year history with eating disorders and the drug abuse and mental health problems associated with bodybuilding attests, there is a dark side. Indeed, underpinning the fitness industry are hegemonic Western body and gender ideals, the slim, the muscular, the young, the white, that are highly exclusive, alienating, and ironically often pursued at the detriment to physical and mental health. So to quickly reflect now on Dowden's statement, it is now time to work out to help out, I would argue that it has never been more important to reflect critically upon what we are personally and collectively investing into when we visit our gyms. The fitness industry is hugely influential. Its discourses contribute to both individual and collective consciousness, informing our understanding of health, fitness, beauty, bodies, and wellness. As history shows, these heavily value-laden concepts can change over time. And as we move forward, it will be important to set aside our inherited body and gender colonialism if we are to move forwards and towards a more inclusive and diverse vision for the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Kay. That was, again, super interesting, and great to see your kind of reflections on what this history can tell us about today's concerns as well. So again, if anyone has any questions as we get into the discussion, please just submit them through the Q&A, and I'll go through them then. But we'd really welcome any comments, points, questions, anything at all. So please do submit them. But yeah, I was just going to kind of start the discussion. Just wanted to ask you both about the issue of class and how that kind of features in these new projects that you're looking at.
Should I? I'll
Yeah,
go
sure, ChiChi. Yeah, great.
Yeah, I definitely think that class is an element here, and I think Kristen mentioned about there's a question in the chat about the intergenerational relationships between the students and mothers in relation to Mothercraft, and I think this video also kind of brings that together with notions of class. So we see in the start with the mothers, I think there's I think, and I need to double check all of this, but I think there are different classes of women in Hong Kong being represented there, given the way that they're dressed, whether they're using a sling or not, and their hairstyling. And I think this is really important in considering this particular artifact from the 1950s, which is the start of the Hong Kong boom after the war. So it would be really interesting to see as well how you know, motherhood was being talked about and shaped in terms of different classes. And from my preliminary understanding, these health centres and the Harcourt Health Centre and the slightly earlier iteration of it in Hong Kong were used by quite a lot of the local Hong Kong women throughout Hong Kong. However, it would have been those that were on Hong Kong Island or on the Kowloon Peninsula, which basically means that all of those that were in what is known as the New Territories didn't have or didn't use these services. So I think, yeah, for me, class is definitely an element that I'll have to look into. But in terms of the Hong Kong context and from that video, it seems to have been a very class inclusive environment. However, I think there is a certain element of classism, and also perhaps then, like, if I could think of it as intergenerational relationship between the students and the mothers as well, because a lot of the demonstrations of how to do things were using the mothers that were considered more traditionally Chinese, whereas when you were being shown how to do something by the students of Mothercraft, it was normally showing the women and the mothers that were dressed more modernly in that video. So
yeah, great. Thanks, ChiChi. And just, you know, following on there with Kristen's question about that kind of intergenerational relationship, she's also just asked about did the mothers involved in Mothercraft have a role in the structure of instruction, or have you got a sense of, you know, who was designing these?
I honestly don't know. I think that it was designed by G.K. Byrne or someone like her in her position, because in the Wellcome Library collection there is a few documents based on like the script or like a transcript of the script or like conversations. So it'll be interesting to see that. And based on a few conversations that I've had with people who have conducted oral interviews with women from the 50s and 60s, it seemed like there really wasn't that much of an interaction of local women structuring training or the provision of care. But given that British nurses were training local nurses, I think through the training system, which really had come into effect in the 1920s, but then was interrupted by the war, I think that sort of continuation of having local nurses in Hong Kong being trained and being recruited, so because it was less expensive than constantly flying out British nurses, I think sort of that sort of system of nursing kind of helps create these sort of programs. That's my gut instinct, but I don't know.
Great. No, thanks. That's really interesting, and yeah, I'm looking forward to finding out more as you progress with this project. Kay, did you want to talk a little bit about class maybe and how it relates to the history of fitness?
Yeah, so fitness, the history of fitness and physical culture is really intersected by class. It's quite complex really, and for example the Zander gyms in the 19th century and the Zander equipment, so as I mentioned, it was closely linked to rehabilitation of sort of the workers in Germany and on the continent and in the First World War. It does have, you know, the gyms are closely related to rehabilitation of the working class, but at the same time, these kind of this equipment is also used in continental spas and spa culture. And I did an oral history with someone who whose mother had one of these pieces of equipment at home, and she was wealthy enough to have one of these pieces. In terms of bodybuilding, it was a very, and sort of gym culture, that was very working class phenomena, male. But then we look at Jane Fonda, as it moves to sort of middle class women, and yeah, so it's a really interesting story, and it's a really important part of it. Interestingly, Sandow, he portrays himself as a gentleman. He comes from a working class background, but he portrays himself as a gentleman, but he makes his equipment available to, you know, everyone. That is a quite the manufacturing, it meant a lot of the technology was available at a lower price, so upper working classes then, so it becomes more accessible. Yeah,
great, thanks Kay. And yeah, the point you made about Sandow as well, like some of the photographs you had in your presentation were really striking, of Sandow, but then later of Fonda. And I think a lot of the Sandow ones are available on the Wellcome collection as well, if anyone wants to go and look at them, but they're just great, really great images. So we've got a few questions from the audience. So I'll start with Fabiola Creed has got a question for Kay. So she's asking, when were heating technologies first introduced into these physical fitness spaces? So things like saunas, hot springs, heating clothes, liquid and UV technologies to assist with developing individual or communal fitness by loosening muscles or speeding up muscle recovery and increasing flexibility. And if you know when this kind of science around, I guess, heat and physical fitness began to develop.
wow, that's an interesting question. I haven't really come across the heating technologies in the fitness spaces. I must admit my work is more on late 19th, early 20th centuries, but in that period we do see like Turkish baths were very popular in Britain, where people would go, effectively saunas, and afterwards they would get a massage, and that was part of a physical culture of loosening up the body. But it wasn't a sense of people would go in and do a fitness class there. In the late 19th century, the physiotherapists and masseuses in Britain started to work with heat technology, electricity, heat baths to loosen up the body in a therapeutic sense. But I haven't come across any sources that have discussed how this might be used in the fitness sense. Yeah, who knows? If I did a bit more work on Sandow, maybe he would advocate using his combined developer in the sauna. You never know. So I've yet to look into that, though. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you for your answer. And then we've got a question from Eva for ChiChi. So she says, you mentioned that Mothercraft centres often originated throughout the British Empire in response to local needs. So she asks, were there ever conflicts between the colonial agenda of the metropole and the local needs these centres were designed to serve?
Thanks, Eva, for the question. I'm going to say, in a nutshell, I'm going to say broadly no, because I don't think it was a big enough issue for it to create enough conflict for it to be a problem. And because they were often, from the literature that I've read, it was often vested or concerned individuals who wanted to ensure that, you know, the next generation of whoever were strong enough for whatever purposes in that particular context, that it often wasn't in contrast, or it wasn't conflicting any sort of ideals in those colonial settings. So even when there's a historian who looks at the development of motherhood and mothercraft in India and the different contexts, in the different sort of regions in India and the way that it was adapted, it doesn't seem to have led to any sort of conflict, because it was constantly being adapted to the local sort of ideals. Not to say that that's not problematic, but in terms of creating conflict between how we think of, you know, colonial societies, I don't think it was a source of conflict, no. But I could be very wrong.
That's great. And we've a question from Katrina. So Katrina was asking about, well, she says about baby weeks in Hong Kong in the 1920s and 30s seem to have been driven as much by commercial and marketing interests by companies like Nestle, as by state, professional or health interests. And she's wondering if you saw any evidence of this in the video itself or in how it was shown to the students.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that information. I'm going to have to look into those baby weeks as well. But no, I couldn't see any evidence of that. In fact, there was a lot of, there was a segment which talks about the use of using like an old biscuit box to keep all the, you know, things that you require for cleaning a baby together. And there was, the biscuit box itself was whited out. So there was no branding on it. And if you know anything about Hong Kong biscuit tins, they're quite visual, and you can definitely tell which brands they are. But there was an effort actually in the video, now that, you know, that's been brought to my attention, of not, you know, being aligned with any particular brand, which is really interesting. Yeah.
Great, thanks, ChiChi. I was going to ask Kay a question as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the kinds of sources you've been using, Kay, in your research? I mean, both on the history of physiotherapy, but, you know, with this kind of new project on fitness. Yeah, could you just talk us through the types of sources you use for this work?
So this talk really was a bit of an indulgence, actually, because it's something I've been thinking about recently, and I wanted to look a bit more broadly at the context of physical therapy that I'm looking at the moment. But I have looked, so my main sources for sort of my work on gyms, therapeutic gyms, comes from material culture, and that sort of led me into sort of researching these gyms, and there's lots of pamphlets and adverts, and I was lucky enough to go over to, so the Science Museum have on display one of these fantastic machines, and I went last year to the Museum Boerhaave in the Netherlands, and they have a whole series of them because they took them out of one of these institutes. And it's really amazing to be able to do an object history on this, and you just find out a whole new history just from looking into this one object, which was quite enlightening for me as a historian, because during my PhD I only ever used documentary sources. I just wasn't schooled in using material culture or images. I used images as illustrations, if you will, to sort of describe, you know, what I was reading. So that was really interesting, and I've done a few oral histories in connection with my work with material culture, which was just, it's really, really rewarding. Yeah, so, and when I was, and yeah, so that's the kind of material I drew on for this talk.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think the use of objects is super interesting. I mean, it's not something I do myself, but yeah, like again, I just find it really fascinating how they can be used. So we have another question for ChiChi from Yun. So Yun asks, could you talk a little bit more about the students who trained in the Mothercraft program? Do you know anything about their backgrounds or who they were?
No, but I think that if they were working at the Harcourt Health Centre, there were nurses that were being trained, like local nurses or midwives in that context. But when you look at that video, I just don't think that they're old enough to be nurses. And given the way that the narrator talks about these students, it seems to have been like pitched at just women that were interested, that, you know, were going to be mothers later. It almost looked like they were in school and they were, you know, this was just part of their education in school. But in terms of those that would provide training, they would have been nurses and midwives in the Hong Kong health system.
Great. And another question which is interesting from Zhao Yizhu. So they ask, you know, was there any courses and training provided to fathers at that time to help mothers raise their children better?
I don't think so. I don't think training or thinking about fatherhood really came into effect, especially in Britain, till after the war. I think about the 70s, which coincided with, you know, equal rights and the rise of feminism again, because men started then to, you know, well, I mean, there was the I'm not an expert in this area, but from memory, it was in the 70s that there was this rise of understanding about fatherhood and thinking about how to train fathers, because there should be equal parenting as such. And that's when you start to see more and more men in the delivery room from the 70s and 80s onwards, and that was just not a thing until that about the 70s.
Yeah. I think, that's similar in a lot of countries, isn't it, really, that the kind of emphasis was on the mother. Yeah, so we've got another question for Kay. Kay, Lucy is asking, I wondered if you've looked much into the social aspects of physical cultures. Oh, that's actually really interesting. You know, the people going to the gym and taking up classes and then establishing connections and friendships centered around those shared experiences of physical cultures. So yeah, if that has come through at all in your research, or is that more of a kind of modern phenomenon, I guess?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, and it makes me want to look more into physical culture and in this area in the 20th century. I think there's a lot of scope actually for looking at the social aspects of fitness, community, mental health, the connection between mental health, fitness in the 20th century. And mobilizing oral histories, actually. I think it's just would be great to do that, looking at sort of certain groups. So for example, I know in Scotland there's quite a lot of crazy, people that go swimming outdoors, and there's quite a cult. When I was living in London, they used to do it in Hyde Park. I'd be like, what are you doing? So there's sort of communities of friendships and shared experiences, which would be great to explore, but it's not something that I've been able to really get into in my work in the 19th century.
Yeah, but yeah, I guess you kind of see there's a lot of that discussion in kind of histories of sport and kind of playing as part of a team and how important that is from a social perspective, but less so kind of from the gym or fitness class perspective. So yeah, we just have kind of one final question really, just to kind of round up the discussion. So yeah, I was just going to ask both of you, what do you think we can learn from the history of these topics, and how can we kind of think about how can history help us better understand modern day concerns around motherhood or fitness?
Should I?
Yeah, whoever wants to go.
So I think that it's it can help us really think critically about the sort of things that we might take for granted today, and the nature of things and the complexity. So rather than sort of coming up with any answers, I feel that looking at the history of things really just helps to sort of open my mind a bit more and see that things aren't so fixed, and things have transformed and can transform. So how can we work with others to look forward? That's kind of where I am with it.
So yeah, great final question, and I'm going to tie it in with Maria's question. Maria asked about the use of my term instinctual and how I contrast it with scientific. And I think the reason why I was interested in this sort of topic was because a lot of my friends are becoming mothers, first mothers, or mothers to second children, and there's a lot of talk and anxiety about being the right sort of mother. So when I saw this source, it really spoke to me. And I'm not a mother myself, so all I've ever really said to them was, my friends, is normally like, you're definitely doing the right thing. There's no one way of doing it. You just listen to your gut. And so Maria has asked about the problematic nature of using instinctual and contrasting that with scientific. And I certainly don't believe that, within the scientific creation of knowledge, there isn't an element of instinct or whatnot in there. I was using that in terms of how Mothercraft itself was constructing a division between the instinctual motherly instincts versus the science that was coming in to try and justify a lot of these instinctual elements. So a lot of the historiography kind of emphasizes there's a right way to do things, but it is an adaptation of what women have been doing, for millions of years. Whereas whereas I think this video is really interesting because it's the first instance where I see this sort of fluidity between what Mothercraft as a movement characterizes as instinctual versus scientific. And it's in that sort of relationship and boundary that I found this video particularly interesting. And I don't think the characterization of Mothercraft as this sort of, one sort of entity, I think that needs rethinking. And I think that relates to the anxiety that I see a lot of women today have about being the right sort of mother. And with the explosion of like Instagram cultures and like how to be, the perfect woman, career, being a mother or being an active mother, with gym culture as well. I think that all kind of comes together in these questions, and there is a history to that. And I've just attached it to this particular program. Sorry. Sorry.
No problem. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you both so much again for two really, really interesting presentations. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all of the questions because we're just running out of time. But please do tune in next week to our CSHHH Summer School. You can follow that on Twitter and see what our postgrads are working on. And then we'll be back on the 6th of August with our third webinar with Peter Clark and Jim Mills on drugs and drug cultures, which is going to be chaired by Katrina Ellis. So please do register in advance on Eventbrite for that, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. So thanks again to our speakers and everyone who tuned in, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, guys. Bye. Bye.